All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. We want to thank you all for your tremendous support. But we wanted to jump right into our program by expressing our deepest sympathies for the loss, or to the family for the loss of one of the greatest fighters of all time, the late, great, marvelous Marvin Hagler, who is untimely passing at the age of 66 years old. And we definitely wanted to do our tribute program to this great champion, this great warrior. And it's something that we do at Chin Check Radio, is that we pay homage to these fighters long after their glory years, long after the fans' adulations and their adoration. It's something that we take that personal because we respect the sacrifice that these guys make in order to step into the boxing ring. Quickly about this man's career. Marvin Hagler is known as a pride of Brockton, Massachusetts. Anytime he had a formal ring introduction, it was from Brockton, Massachusetts. But actually, Hagler was born in Newark, New Jersey. Now, why is that significant, Chin Check Radio? Because that is where we are from. Hagler was born May 23rd, 1954, born in Newark, New Jersey. Brick City tough, left after the Newark riots in 1967. But Hagler is from Newark, New Jersey, specifically the Central Ward, which is actually where my folks stay at now, and that's where I go to visit. I'm actually was born and raised in the North Ward. So definitely that little connection with Hagler being from Newark, New Jersey. Now, Hagler had a total ring career of 67 fights, 62 wins, 52 big wins by KO, 3 losses, and 2 draws. So just some quick fights, and we're really going to try to break his career down. Now, let me say this. I didn't grow up watching Marvin Hagler. He clearly was a little bit before our time, but I have enough fights in my boxing collection of Marvin Hagler to really gauge how great he truly was, as well as watching numerous documentaries on him and some of his legendary fights. So again, even though I did not grow up watching Marvin Hagler, but I've watched enough of his fights, and a lot of these fights I'm actually going to discuss are fights that I do have on my VHS boxing collection. So definitely was a fan of the man. So let's just jump right into it. A notable fight, August 30th, 1974, a unanimous decision victory over Sugar Ray Seales. So keep the name Sugar Ray in mind. So this is Sugar Ray Seales. Why is that significant? Because Sugar Ray Seales was the only American boxer in the 1972 Olympics to win a gold medal. So this clearly was a guy who had some skills, and Hagler beat him. In November 26, 1974, a draw against the same Sugar Ray Seales. Now understand something about Marvin Hagler. Marvin Hagler was a guy who worked his way up the amateur ranks. Now, this is juxtaposed with another American golden child, which was Sugar Ray Leonard, the pretty smile, the good looks, and came out of the 1976 Olympic boxing team with a lot of flair and pizzazz. So Hagler won a bunch of AAU championships and national championships, but really never sought the Olympic gold. Being trained by the Petronelli brothers, Pat and Goody, decided to begin a professional career. And we're talking 1920 fights in. And there's a famous saying, and he stated this, that the late Joe Frazier told him this. The reason why he wasn't getting the quality of opposition that he wanted, because he had 3 things going against him. He was black, he was southpaw, and he was good, because it makes him a very avoidable fight. Now, what does that mean? If Hagler beats you, it does more harm to a person's career. If you beat Hagler, you really get nothing out of it, because he was really a true unknown, and he was a good fighter. So again, you're going to have a rough time either way. So watching documentaries, his trainer said for us to really make our move in the middleweight division, because keep this in mind, the middleweight division has always been seen as a special division, and we're going to get into the reasons why. But at that time in the 70s, the real hotbed of the middleweight division, the lion's den, so to speak, was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and more specifically the Spectrum. So fighting a fight in only 2 weeks' notice On January 13, 1976, lost a majority decision to Bobby Boogaloo Watts. Now, keep this in mind. Hagler fought December 20th of 1975, defeating one Johnny Baldwin. So literally 3 weeks later, fought a fight in Philadelphia known as the Lion's Den of middleweight fighters. In March 9th of 1976, again at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, lost a unanimous decision against Willie Monroe. So that's something that kind of Hagler could have fallen by the wayside. He could have kind of been knocked out of the, kind of fell to the back of the pack. Kind of never really thought of. Again, you have a guy who was undefeated, 25 fights, steps up his level of opposition, loses 2 close decisions, and he easily could have been written off. But he wasn't, because September of 1976, a referee stoppage against Eugene Cyclone Hart. So definitely a solid fighter from back then. A rematch against one Willie Monroe, February 15, 1977, a TKO in the 12th round. March of 1977, a KO victory in the 3rd round versus Reggie Ford. Another fight, August of 1977, a TKO victory in the 2nd round against the aforementioned Willie Monroe. A TKO victory in the 12th round against Mike Colbert. And by the way, Mike Colbert had his jaw broken. November of 1977. March 4th, 1978, a TKO victory in the 9th round against Kevin Finnegan, who had to receive 40 stitches after that fight. August of 1978, a unanimous decision victory against Benny Briscoe, again in the Spectrum. Another fight, 3rd fight against Sugar Ray Seals, a TKO victory in the 1st round, February 3rd, 1979. So again, Hagler has slowly started to work his way up in the middleweight ranks. Now, this is how different it was back then versus now. We have guys 10, 15, 20 fights getting a title shot. We can trace that back to maybe Fernando Vargas, who kind of started that trend of young fighters receiving a title shot. Before Hagler received his first title shot, he already had 49 professional fights. Put that into perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Most professional fighters now don't even reach 49 fights total. This man had 49 fights before he even reached his first title shot. And this is literally TKOs all over his record, running through competition, dominating competition, beating the guys who beat him on more than one occasion. And he finally gets his title fight against Vito Antuofermo. And when people say one of the worst decisions in boxing history, November 30th of 1979, the fight was a draw. Now, I have that fight on video. Hagler clearly dominated that fight, beat the brakes off of Antuofermo. And it's funny because how legend has it that when they were getting ready to announce the winner, his late trainer, one of the Petronelli, says that, hey, the referee tells Marvin, hey, you stand on this side because when they announce you the winner, I want to raise your hand and I want them to take a picture of me raising your hand as a new middleweight champion. The fight was ruled a draw, an awful decision. So now Hagler is left to continue plugging along, which is really was the hallmark of his career. I think that fight versus Antuofermo is a fight that really turned the switch on in Marvin Hagler's head, that he even stated, and I'm kind of pantomiming with his fist, and he said that these were going to be his judges. And I think that fight made him distrust the system, made him, I'm not going to say bitter at the system, but never really having fully faith in the system. And you can make an argument that less than a decade later, that misplaced or mistrust in the system was revealed in his final fight. But let's continue on with this man's career. In April of 1980, he beat Bobby Watts in the TKO in the 2nd round. In May of 1980 versus Marcus Giraldo, a unanimous decision. He finally gets his rematch against Alan Minter. September 27th of 1980, has to go to the man's home country in Wembley Arena in London, England for the WBA, the WBC, and the reigning middleweight titles. And again, I had that fight on video. It was an absolute massacre. Famously, Alan Minter said that no black man was going to take his title. Again, this is back in the 1980s. No black man was going to take his title, and yet a black man waltzed into London, England, sliced, diced, carved him up, TKO in 3 rounds. They really had to stop the fight. And in one of the most disgusting displays in boxing history that I don't think really gets talked about, especially in England. Just throwing this out there. You just had the recent story regarding the royal family and Meghan Markle and one of the princes talking about the racism in the royal family. And we know about the racism in England and how they treat their black soccer players. This in 1980. Now, again, this man has won the middleweight championship of the world. Why is the middleweight championship of the world so perceived? Is because middleweights have always seen as having heavyweight power and welterweight speed. So we're talking back then, you had heavyweights, you had your heavyweights, your light heavyweights, your middleweights, and your welterweights. And your middleweights and obviously your lightweights and your featherweights. They were always seen as guys who possess heavyweight knockout punching power, yet the speed of welterweight. So that's why there always was a fascination with the middleweight division. So winning his title, not even enjoying the fruits of one's labor, not even having the opportunity to stand in the ring with his hand raised. The fans in England threw water bottles and trash at this man, and this man had to be hustled out of the ring with his head covered. And his late trainer, Goody Petronelli, stated that it was weird to me. We won the title, and we had to run out the arena like we were burglars, like we had committed a crime, and the man won his title fair and square, to the point the man in London, England had to be awarded his title back in the locker room. If that's not a black eye on London boxing, I don't know what is. If that is not one of the most disgusting displays in boxing history, I don't know what is. So, first title defense, Fulgencio Albin, and it's hard to pronounce his last name, a TKO victory in the 8th round, January of 1981. A rematch against Vito Antuofermo, June 13th. A referee stoppage in the 4th round. And folks, this is a long campaign. And I'm going to say, and I say campaign of terror in quotes, and I say that jokingly, but this was a dominant campaign in any weight class in boxing history, the tear that Hagler is about to go through in this middleweight division. Next fight after that, October 3rd, 1981, a TKO victory in the 11th round versus Mustafa Hamsho. March of 1982, a TKO in the 1st round against William Lee. A rematch against Fulgencio, TKO in the 5th round, October of 1982. A TKO in the 6th round against Tony Simpson, February of 1983. A KO in the 4th round versus Wilfred Scipion, May of 1983. So again, this is knockout after knockout after knockout of just running through folks, no questions asked. Now, March of 1984, a TKO victory. Actually, let me go back. I skipped a major fight here. Excuse me. November 1983, a unanimous decision victory over Roberto Duran. Now, this is a fight, if you want to compare careers or discuss fantasy matchups, Roberto Duran was the first guy to go the distance with Hagler as the middleweight champion. Again, Hagler was running through guys, beating the brakes off of guys, knocking guys out, breaking jaws, having guys get stitches. And in that fight, and I also have that fight as well on video, and I also have that fight hanging up on one of my walls, or a picture of that fight rather. And keep in mind, this is the Roberto Duran who fought at welterweight, who is seen as probably the greatest lightweight in the world, and gave Hagler probably his toughest fights. And Hagler really had to eke out that decision in order to win that fight. So he was given a tough fight by one Roberto Duran. And keep this in mind, this is the same Duran after the whole No Mas fiasco. And to give this guy, the middleweight champion, the toughest fight, really up to that time, the toughest fight of his career. That's why some people, when you go into fantasy matchups, you tend to dock points away from Hagler. But again, a victory is a victory. March of 1984, a TKO in the 10th round versus Juan Roland. Why that fight even significant? That is the only time where a fighter was credited with a knockdown against Marvin Hagler. In October of 1984, a TKO victory in the 3rd round in a rematch versus Mustafa Hamsho. Ladies and gentlemen, that is one of the most brutal fights you'll ever see. And I remember Hagler on an interview once said that he never really liked Hamsho. That's the one guy he truly did not like, and it showed. A lot of people felt that maybe Hagler was starting to slip with the close decision wins against Roberto Duran, even though he TKO'd Juan Roldan. It still was a very competitive fight, so people thought that maybe Hagler was slipping, especially Hamsho. If you go back and watch old interviews, and Hagler destroyed this man in 3 rounds, a very brutal knockout. In April 15th, 1985, now this is the fight that I think to mainstream fans of that era, okay, well, yeah, mainstream casual fans, is a fight that really put Hagler on the map. And please go back, and I mentioned this before, watch that HBO Legendary Fight series on Hagler Hearns. One of the greatest fights ever in boxing history for all of its 3 rounds. A TKO victory in the 3rd round versus Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Now, folks, if you go back and watch that first round is seen as one of the greatest rounds in boxing history. And by one of the greatest rounds, I'm talking along the lines of Bo Holyfield, round 10. Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales, round 5. I can make an argument, Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz, round 3. So that round is considered Arturo Gatti, Mickey Ward in their first fight, round 9. So definitely consider one of the greatest rounds ever in boxing history was that round 1. And again, now, setting the stage up for this fight, there was always talk of Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard getting into the ring. Remember, Sugar Ray Leonard was a golden boy, was that era's golden boy before one Oscar De La Hoya in my era. He was that era's golden child, cash cow, Olympic boxing star. Everything flowed off of him. He was a star of that era because remember, this is the end of Muhammad Ali. Tyson started to come up, but he wasn't really the mega star yet. So Sugar Ray Leonard was that star of the early 1980s. He clearly was the guy. He was a cash cow. He was a guy that everybody wanted to fight. Now, there was a press conference that everybody had set up, that Sugar Ray Leonard had invited a bunch of people to, and people swore up and down, including Marvin Hagler, who was invited to the event. A lot of people swore up and down that Hagler was going to get in that fight with Ray Leonard, or that Ray Leonard was going to announce a fight with Marvin Hagler. And Ray Leonard gave this great speech and had everybody on the edge of their seats and said that, and I believe I'm paraphrasing here, a fight with this great man, with this great champion is going to be an all-time classic, but unfortunately, it'll never happen. And he walked away from the ring. So now at this point, Hagler left without a big-name opponent because, again, even these other middleweights who he's beaten and tore through weren't really household names, but the one name was Roberto Duran. So really a big-name fight that really could have guaranteed Hagler a lot of money was the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. But since that fight wasn't going to happen, takes on Thomas the Hitman Hearns, the former welterweight champion, 154, and former knockout puncher. Now, this is Thomas Hearns, who is fresh off a destructive one-punch KO knockout over one Roberto Duran. The same Roberto Duran who gave Hagler his toughest fight. So there definitely was cause for concern whether Hearns would be able to beat Marvin Hagler. Again, he destroys Roberto Duran, overhand right, knocks him out. Talking about Duran is out before he hits the canvas. And the same Duran who gave Hagler his toughest fight. And again, this is Thomas Hearns with the boxing, and the late Emmanuel Stewart in his corner, Kronk Gym, everything with it. So that's kind of the backdrop of this fight. Again, watch that documentary on Hearns Hagler, the legendary fights on HBO. I'm sure it'll probably be on YouTube. And these guys went out and they had a war. And clearly, Thomas Hearns landed his best punch, crunched Marvin Hagler right upside the head with his best right hand. You saw Hagler kind of buckle a little bit. He took the punch. Now you can make an argument, the fact that Hagler was actual natural middleweight and Hearns actually moving up in weight. Maybe the knockout power didn't carry the same, but Marvin Hagler had one of the greatest chins ever in boxing history, so I don't think it really mattered. And lands an overhand right on Marvin Hagler. Hagler clearly got, I'm not going to say stunned, but Hearns got his attention. He covers up, and these guys are just throwing leather, throwing bombs. And it's to the point, if you actually watch that first round, it's actually hard to even pick a winner of that first round. And that's the ironic part. One of the greatest rounds in boxing history is really hard to actually pick a winner of that round. So, of course, the fight goes on. At this point, you can start to see Hagler starting to assert his advantage physically. I remember Emmanuel Stewart, if you go back and watch that fight, was telling Thomas Hearns, just box him, stay away and box him. Don't get caught up in the punches, just box him. But at this point, Hearns was caught up in the motions, and he kept slugging out with Hagler. Third round, Hagler has a vicious cut on his face. Goes out there. Now, Hagler thinking, or what he says in these documentaries, he's thinking that if I don't continue this fight, even with this cut, they're going to take my titles from me. And Hagler really defined himself by those middleweight titles. And he went out there and he went after Thomas Hearns, knocked him out in the third round. And again, that's a fight that really put Hagler on the map as a great fighter. He became a mainstream star doing different endorsements. So that really put Hagler in households of America in the mid-1980s. In March of 1986, a KO victory in a brutal fight versus John the Beast Mugabe. Folks, that was a very brutal, brutal fight. That's the fight that's credited that might have given Sugar Ray Leonard the idea of fighting Marvin Hagler, to the point where a lot of people felt that Hagler was an older fighter. Now, again, this fight happened in March of 1986. Hagler won the middleweight title in 1980. So this is 6 years of dominance, 6 years of running through guys, where people watching Hagler of that era and even watching in my fight collection is that slick boxer who can move and had fast hands turned more into a slugger who relied pretty much on three things: his conditioning, his chin, and his punching power. Where the reflexes weren't the same anymore, he was a slower fighter. He was a southpaw, a switch hitter inside the ring. But by that time, Hagler might have been a little bit past his best. Now, you have to understand, even though fighters now are performing at a high level, even when they're older, see the Tom Brady's of the world, but we're talking about back then, 34 years old, was considered relatively old back then. So let's also put that in mind. So yes, he might have been a little bit older. He might have been a step slower, but that's just how it was for that time frame. Now, of course, with dieting and nutrition and technology, athletes are able to have more longevity now than he did back then. So it might have been true that Hagler was starting to show some of the effects of all the ring wars, and especially in that Mugabe fight, even though he won that fight. But I remember the doctor, Flip Homansky, said that it took a lot physically out of Marvin Hagler. And there's an old saying in boxing, once it's beaten out of you, once it's taken physically out of you, you're never the same fighter ever again. So that's why the word is that Ray Leonard kind of saw that fight, knew Hagler was a declining fighter, and decided to take that fight, which happened April 6th of 1987, and a split decision win versus Sugar Ray Leonard. Now, folks, till this day, now this fight is almost 24 years ago. I'm sorry, 34 years ago. Till this day, there is still debate as to who won that fight. Now, when I watch documentaries on that fight, and I'm going to tell you my personal opinion on that fight in a second, but it's kind of the backdrop here. So again, Ray Leonard comes out of retirement for the second or third time he came out of retirement, decides to fight Marvin Hagler. Now, at this point, you have to assume that Ray Leonard had to be the heavy underdog. Now, again, this is Marvin Hagler, 6-7 years undefeated reigns as champion, and we're talking about maybe another decade of not even being beaten in the ring, just dominating fighters. Ray Leonard coming back, having a detached retina, fighting another fight, and I forget who he came back and fought in which he was knocked down in that fight. So Ray Leonard at this time was doing commentary for HBO. So you would have to think that, again, now Ray Leonard is still the cash cow. Even though Hagler now is a mainstream star, and there was an old video of him on the Johnny Carson show. So Hagler is enjoying the fruits of his labor and now is a mainstream star, but still Ray Leonard was the superstar. So you had a star and you have the superstar. So that's still a fight that Hagler wanted. Now, if you go back and watch old interviews, people state, or at least in Hagler's camp, that he really didn't want to take that fight. You know, at this point, he saw himself, and rightfully so, as a star. He didn't have to chase Ray Leonard like he did when he was coming up through the ranks, and especially as a younger champion, or I would say a new champion. So he decided to take that fight, kind of pushed into taking that fight. He really didn't want it. And looking at the Ray Leonard camp, I remember the attorney in one documentary, the Hagler's camp conceded to every one of Ray Leonard's demands. I'm talking about a larger ring, 12 rounds, and I believe even the glove size. So I guess Hagler figured, well, I'll just concede to all these demands. I'm going to beat Ray Leonard anyway, so all that is not going to matter. So again, a fight was made, lost by split decision. Now, reading these scores about this fight, Judge Jojo Guerra scored the fight 118-110 in favor of Ray Leonard. Ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much, out of a 12-round fight, that's pretty much giving Leonard 9 rounds. So pretty much only gave 3 rounds to Marvin Hagler. So 9 rounds to 3. Judge Dave Moretti scored a fight 115-113 for Ray Leonard. That's 7 rounds to 5. And Judge Lou Filippo scored a fight 115-113. Folks, if you want to know who Judge Lou Filippo is, I believe he's a judge. If you watch Rocky IV, he's the judge in the Apollo Creed and Ivan Drago fight. So that's who Judge Lou Filippo is. Now, what's funny about Jojo Guerra, he later on stated, and upon second viewing the fight, that maybe he made a mistake and should have scored 2 more rounds to Marvin Hagler, which would have made it 116-112 or 8 rounds to 4. And pretty much Dwayne Ford stated that Guerra probably wasn't going to be invited back to judge a fight in Las Vegas. The other scorecards, what Lou Filippo says, he felt that Hagler was the aggressor, that Hagler was taking a fight to Ray Leonard, so he felt that Hagler took the fight as a champion, while Dave Moretti stated that even though Hagler was the aggressor, but he wasn't the effective aggressor, and that is one of the criteria of boxing. You have to show effective aggression. Now, old school fighters will tell you this. Old school fight fans, they will tell you this. You have to beat the champion. I'm talking about you have to beat the hell out of the champion or knock him out. So a lot of the old school guys that I used to talk to say that they don't feel that Leonard won that fight because he really didn't beat the champion. So to take a man's title who's a champion for that long, you really have to beat the man and take his title. And a lot of people feel that Ray Leonard didn't do that. Now, here's where I don't want to say controversy. Now, this is my personal opinion watching the fight. In watching the fight, Ray Leonard clearly understood, and he said it himself, that he understood the psychology of judges, where you have to be flashy to get the judge's attention. And he admitted, and this is Sugar Ray Leonard now, that he told his corner, one guy I believe by the name of Ali Dunlap, that he wanted to scream 30 seconds, and that he would flurry and do the pitter-patter punches and pretty much steal rounds. We later saw this with one Oscar De La Hoya. See the Pernell Whitaker fight. So Ray Leonard understood back then, if you yell 30, I'm going to just start throwing high volume punches to make it look like that I won that round, when in fact he might have done. But he understood psychology and he understood ring scoring. If you go back and watch that fight, you will hear a voice screaming 30, and right on cue, Ray Leonard starts throwing punches. Now, when I first watched that fight on video, I did score the fight for Sugar Ray Leonard, and that's pretty much based on activity. Now, the referee of that fight, Richard Steele, said something interesting on the same documentary, the Legendary Fight Series on Hagler Leonard, was that every time he watches the fight, it gets closer and closer. And I tend to agree with that. Every time that I've watched that fight afterwards, I find myself giving more rounds to Marvin Hagler than I would Ray Leonard. So it's true that you might watch the fight the first time and see the activity, or I guess it was activity, throwing punches, but a 30-second of activity of Ray Leonard, you would give him that round. But then we see that Ray Leonard really wasn't doing anything except waiting for the final 30 seconds to just throw a flurry of punches, you might find yourself giving Hagler more rounds. Now, what generally can hurt Hagler, and people question his decision in that fight, why would he come out and want to prove him being an equal boxer to Ray Leonard, where you're physically the bigger fighter, even though they were height-wise the same. I think Leonard might have been maybe a half inch taller. But in terms of physical strength, Hagler was the stronger fighter. And keep this in mind, this is a Sugar Ray Leonard who hadn't fought in 2-3 years. So that kind of hurts Hagler a little bit. Like, why would he come out so cautious? Maybe he was an older fighter. A lot of people feel that he was trying to prove that he was as good as boxer as Ray Leonard. And that fight turned out to be his last ever professional fight. He was clamoring for a rematch. Clearly, Ray Leonard was going to give it to him. Ray Leonard retired, unretired, retired, unretired. So, of course, playing the waiting game of Ray Leonard, Hagler took his pride, retired, moved to Italy, and became a television and a film star. Now, with Marvin Hagler, it's interesting. A lot of times his career, and it was very unfair to him, where his career, especially in the immediate aftermath after the Ray Leonard fight, he was judged by that fight. But I think as time went on, much like President Lyndon B. Johnson, as time went on, there was a reassessment of his legacy with everything that he's done in his career. And there was always an appreciation of one Marvin Hagler. And this is me coming around, watching boxing, understanding, talking with gentlemen who are older than me, talking with, dad and uncles, and building my fight collection and watching documentaries. So now I started to appreciate Marvin Hagler. And Rock Newman once said in a Sports Center documentary that Hagler always was judged by the Ray Leonard fight, and that wasn't fair. That was just one fight. It doesn't take away anything that he ever did in his career, and because of that, Hagler is always seen as one of the top 5 middleweights of all time. And I'm talking, if you talk about the middleweights, and I explained to you the reason why the middleweight division is such a prestigious division. I mean, he is considered in the same company of the Tony Zales, the Rocky Gracianos, the Carlos Monzones, Harry Greb, Stanley Ketchel, Bernard Hopkins, and you have Marvin Hagler right there. So Hagler in his time in the middleweight division is rightly seen up there. And when I mean up there, I'm talking about usually top 2, top 3, maybe stretching it to number 4 of top middleweights of all time. So as time has gone on, there has been an appreciation of what Marvin Hagler did during his stellar career. And again, it shouldn't be lost. Never knocked out, one official knockdown, one of the highest KO percentage rates of any middleweight, I think the second longest reign, second or third, because you have Bernard Hopkins, you have Carlos Monzon, I'm going to say Zale, and then Marvin Hagler. So I think tied for the third longest reign of a middleweight champion. Now you can go into about being a unified middleweight champion if you have one title, and Hagler actually did win the inaugural IBF middleweight championship. So kind of keep that in mind as well. So always seen as one of the top middleweights of all time, was now even more so seen as one of the greatest fighters of all time. I have a book by the late, great Burt Sugar of one of his favorite fighters of all time. Now, Burt Sugar had been around for a long time. May he rest in peace, a truly boxing historian. He definitely has Hagler listed in his top 50 greatest fighters of all time. Again, I didn't see the man, so I can't really rank him. Again, I didn't grow up watching the man, so I can't rank him in my all-time favorite fighters list because, again, I didn't watch him grow up, but I've watched enough fights of him to understand the man's skill set. And to me, the man truly was a truth, coming from the Northeast, having that grinding persona, that grinding personality about hard work. Now, they always said that Hagler used to isolate himself in training way out in Brockton, Massachusetts, way out in Cape Cod, doing his road work, didn't want to speak to anybody, didn't want to even accept phone calls from his family, got mean. And this is somebody, again, who was robbed the first time, and I mentioned this before, in a Vito Antuofermo fight. And that turned a switch in Hagler. Work hard, knock everybody out, and you don't have to worry about the judges. Now, his distrust in the system that I talked of earlier reared his ugly head in the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. Again, threw his hand up in disgust and walked away. And this man's work ethic was second to none. Again, always showed up in immaculate shape. If you go back and look at his physique back then, ripped up, chiseled, great shape, worked hard, ran his videos of him doing his road work, doing his sit-ups, hitting the speed bag. I mean, this guy clearly worked his tail off to become such a long reigning middleweight champion, which means you have to sacrifice certain things. You have to sacrifice worldly pleasures. To me, the incarnation of one Marvin Hagler in my time is Bernard Hopkins. And I remember there was a special interview between the two of them right before Bernard Hopkins fought Oscar De La Hoya. And a lot of people were comparing that to Sugar Ray versus Marvin Hagler. And Bernard Hopkins told Hagler, what happened to you is not going to happen to me, and I'm going to handle that. And you could tell there was an appreciation, a bit of a smile on his face from Marvin Hagler, telling Bernard Hopkins to keep working hard. If you go on YouTube, well, not YouTube, Google, and Google a picture of the two of them together. So that is the all-time fantasy matchup of middleweights. One Marvin Hagler versus a Bernard Hopkins. And clearly, both of them coming from the Northeast, having to slug the hard road, having to work their way up, having to be ignored but keep winning and not going away. So they were definitely kindred spirits in that regard. And again, Marvin Hagler, one of the greatest fighters of all time, truly entertaining. He will be sorely missed. And I hope that he found peace. And in later interviews, it seemed that he did find some peace in his life. You can tell the Ray Leonard fight still bothered him. But I think as you get older, you tend to get over it. And I think he started to appreciate the accolades he was getting from fans, the love he was getting from fans. I mean, especially amongst the older generation, guys who are older than me, really truly appreciated him, really truly respected him. And I think he was finally, hopefully, able to find peace with it. So to the family of Marvelous Marvin Hagler, once again, we at Chin Check Radio, we offer our deepest sympathies, our condolences, and Marvin Hagler Champ, you truly, truly rest in power. This is Chin Check Radio signing out.